Psychologists of Reddit. What made you realize you were treating a psychopath? Story 1. When telling that he kept thinking about how killing people would be more fun than lame animals, stray cats and dogs, and everything else he could catch? Only 11 years old. Story 2. Clinical psychologist here. At first I didn't know. If anything, given the context, he was more put together than most of my patients. The subject of his criminal past came up. I only knew he had served prison time some years before, not what he was in for. I had met with him a month or two when this came up. Turns out it was 2 separate sentences served. Both were for rape. In both cases, he was the exact thing we are afraid of, a guy lurking in a dark alley jumping a drunk girl. He told me about these things as if he was talking about the weather. When it dawned on me that he expressed no remorse or guilt whatsoever, I got the same cold, gut-wrenching kind of primal fear you feel when you're out for a walk and almost step on snake. Story 3. Current psychologist working in a prison here. I've worked with 3 individuals I dare say would have met the criteria for antisocial personality disorder within the last 2 weeks. One commonality is that they use behaviors as tools to benefit only themselves. Self-harm. Not because they wish to hurt themselves, but to use it as a tool to lure staff into the cell to incite violence. Gain extra medication, be sent to the SHU, which comes with a status. Story 4. When I was a student, we had an interview with a lady that killed her baby child with a handgun because it cried so much that she couldn't take it. At first, we weren't told that she was a psychopath, and we were just told to listen to her side of the story. She was reading us from her journal that she made while she was in the institution. Not once did she mention that she was sad that her baby died, or how what she did was bad. She was just reading angry tots about her husband that left her and turned her in the police about what she did. She was justifying the killing because the baby was so unbearable, and once she mentioned that she was angry and mad that her husband did not believe her, that she didn't have any other choice but to kill the baby. She was very smart and well-spoken, and the whole time she was speaking, she was trying to make us feel sorry for her for being locked up. We later learned that sometimes she was lying about not killing her baby, and other times just brag about it, depending on who she was speaking with. Very normal-looking person and very good speaker. Edit wow, was not expecting this much upvotes. So to answer some of your questions, I am not from the US and I don't think her name will matter to any of you. She was not schizophrenic nor had postpartum psychosis. If she did, she would have felt any kind of remorse about what she did, which she did not. When I said normal person, I meant it in a way that if I was talking to her in any other situation but this in a mental institution, I would have no idea that she is a psychopath. She killed her baby only for one simple reason. At the moment, it just wouldn't stop crying. She didn't try to hide it or anything. At first, she lied to her husband that it was by accident, but then she admitted. Story 5. Often there is a particular face they make when they are relating a story, usually about how clever they are. One of the TED Talks on how to spot a liar calls it duping delight. Sometimes they can't contain their rage, and you see them switch. Edit last sentence is a personal observation not related to the TED Talk. Edit to add link. We had to watch it for our criminology class. As other posters have noted, there is no evidence-based way to spot a liar. I just found the duping delight fascinating. I also see it in the faces of my young niece and nephew at times. Story 6. Not a psych, but I was in the room where my mum was being evaluated. Well, I wasn't in the room, it was like a police interrogation room with the one-way glass. I was there because they needed to interview me for an outsider's perspective. Anyways, my mum got arrested on suspicion to commit a violent crime. To set the scene, she was handcuffed to a table and she was pissed. She's always had volatile anger issues due to heavy drug and alcohol use. She was being talked to, questioned, all this other stuff. I was there for about 3 hours. She kept running this lady in circles to divert her from the actual problem. She was insanely calm, answering questions about various things that would scare a normal person. She barely showed empathy for anything, and it was terrifying for me to watch. I knew she wasn't right in the head anyways. She was abusive to both my brother and I. But seeing how she handled the situation at hand, I'm glad I got out of there or it would have gotten much worse. I haven't talked to her in about 4 years, but she's tried to get in contact. I can't trust her, and don't think I ever will again. Story 7. You feel it in your gut first. Using a validated measure and constructing a thorough case history to discuss in supervision. This is how you test your gut feeling. But you feel it often quite quickly. It tends to begin with just a sense that something is off. When you're doing therapy with someone, we tend to build up quite a strong rapport with people. So there's lots of micro-mimicry going on, and you start to tune in quite deeply to unconscious body language. When you're in this state, sometimes you just start to feel very uneasy and you can't articulate verbally exactly why yet. This is often because of subtle micro-expressions, super fast flashes of emotion, lasting fractions of a second that we perceive, but don't consciously register. You see flashes of contempt-related emotions and burglar smiles. Basically, emotions related to dominance and deception. The next thing you'll notice is a lot of use of projection going on. This starts quite quickly, usually in an assessment session. I mean, as an aside, being assessed by someone else can feel quite threatening to anyone's self-image, let alone a psychopath's. Quite predictably, there will be status challenges, asking you about your credentials, your experience, etc., and then often some put-downs and digs with plausible deniability, e.g., joking that all psychologists are mad themselves, or just turning the tables by asking who's the maddest person you've ever treated. You start to feel on the back foot and like you're now being assessed by them. As time continues, they will attribute a lot of their own emotions to you as the projection deepens, e.g. commenting that you look sad, asking if you're okay, or conversely asking why you got angry just then. As time passes, their affect turns from micro-expressions to more overt dominance displays, leaning back, smirking, getting up and striding around, etc. By this point, your initial gut feeling is getting more supportive evidence and it's time to bust out the validated measures. The biggest sign of all is a general unwillingness to show any vulnerability at all, or to be in a one-down position. The engagement will be superficial, often pally or matey, with lots of banter and joking, always flying close to the wind of outright mockery and contempt. They will start subtly and increasingly become overt in their need to control and dominate the therapy sessions. If the therapist maintains an aloof control, the ante may keep being raised and even end up with overt intimidation of the therapist. Story 8. Not a psychologist, but a nurse who sees way too many psych cases. One time I had a PT who was brought in after trying to break into a family's house while they were home. He was on my telemetry unit because his electrolytes were out, and he was acting like he didn't remember trying to bust into an entire family's house with them home. He was getting antsy, but the hospital I worked at had a stupid fall risk policy that kept patients in bed, even if they were young, healthy, capable of being responsible for their fall. Mental health patients like to pace, especially when they start to feel like they're using it. So, anyway, I'm trying to keep dude in bed because if his feet touch the floor, a loud alarm would go off, pushing his crazy closer to the edge. So, I'm in there trying to talk to him and de-escalate. We're talking and he tells me he is a bad person, that his cat was mutilated, and his sister asked what happened to it, and he told her the dog did it. But he told me that his secret is that he did it. He killed the cat so bad that it looked like a dog ripped it to pieces. He also shared with me that he knew what he was doing when he tried breaking into the family's home, and that he wants to hurt people. Of course, I shared this info with the hospitalist and the psychologist, and naturally, he was discharged free and clear the next day. No follow-up with the law or outpatient psych. Gotta love it. Story 9. Not a psychologist, but from my experience of dating a psychopath, didn't know until years in. A lot of what appears as emotion is simply mirroring emotions they see others exhibit, and how they believe is the socially appropriate way to respond, whether or not they actually feel that way. This is how they blend in and appear normal to the average person. They are narcissistic, and everything revolves around them. They are always able to place blame on other people. Nothing is ever their fault. However, anything positive in their lives or others' lives is because of them. Because they are narcissists, they believe they are much more important than they actually are. They have strong influence over others because of their ability to feel nothing when manipulating others, and this is how they exert control over others. They will do whatever it takes in order to come out on top of a situation with no actual regard for others' lives or feelings. They may fake their feelings or reactions to continue to manipulate those around them, and they get pleasure over having control over other people and feeling like they're pulling all the strings. Story 10. Okay, so what's the difference between psychopathy and narcissism? People seem to be only focusing on how most psychopaths are narcissistic, but they're not really mentioning anything else. I'm autistic, and, because of my very low empathy, I come across as mildly psychopathic. However, I have very low self-esteem. I do not manipulate people, as far as I can tell. My former roommate, on the other hand, was a narcissist to a trash-steeped T, to the point where she abused and manipulated me in so many ways over the course of a year. Yet the descriptions in this thread are conflating. So what other traits of a psychopath are there? What differentiates us? Story 11. The eyes when they believe they're supposed to put on an emotion. You have to understand. It's going ouch when you bang your funny bone, even though it doesn't hurt, because all your life, people have cried out in pain when they've banged their elbow. You meet enough people like that and you find yourself hating any obligational situation in your life when you have to lie, like being asked how you are and saying good when you're not, simply because all you can associate it with is them. Story 12. I'm not a psychologist, but I know a few, have studied it extensively, and my sister works with MH in the police. He told me he tried to care how people feel, but he doesn't know how that would even come about. How do you know you care for someone? How do you not feel indifferent? He just said he has three emotions: indifference, anger, and pity. Story 13. I typed out a long response to this but then deleted it because I couldn't really describe it without giving too many details away. One thing I will say is that psychopaths aren't all your classic murderous criminals. Sometimes the nicest people you'll meet are psychopaths, and it's all an act to manipulate you to do what they want or think a certain way about them, because that makes them feel like they've won and/or are superior to you. Watch out for the nice guys. Story 14. There is so much misinformation in this thread. Lots of people who have clearly spent too much time watching Criminal Minds and reading Wikipedia pages. You technically can't even diagnose psychopathy, at least clinically. The PCLR, which people have mentioned see cherry-picked, is a list of the traits commonly seen in psychopaths, and is not conclusive, as many people can display these traits and not be a psychopath as such. The very model of the traits of psychopathy is reductionist, and tends to ignore the context under which the behavior takes place in favor of a quick diagnosis, as people scramble to see the motive in an offender's actions after the fact. Most people that fit the traditional behavioral role of a psychopath aren't violent offenders, but rather highly successful individuals who lean toward careers that reward their lack of empathy. It is even harder to recognize in children, and the idea of the psychopathic triad killing animals, obsession with fire, and long-term bedwetting, which has long been seen to be a predictor if future violent behavior, was first posited in 1964 and has been the subject of heavy debate ever since. For some context, whenever you write any kind of paper in any psychology class, research is considered out of date after 5 years. Not 55. I don't claim to be a psychologist for karma. I have studied it, but not in any amount that makes me qualified to treat people. But it needed to be said that people are shamelessly milking the classic idea of a psychopath for internet points. Openly and shamelessly narcissistic behavior, then following it with a lack of remorse or admission of guilt, and topping it off with a big old load of shallow affect, which would make most of the people commenting on this thread, as judged by themselves, psychopaths. Funny that. Story 15. This thread is interesting, so I thought I'd contribute. I'm not a psychologist, I'm a criminologist. Obviously, it's not the same sort of thing, and I've never been in a clinical situation, but you might be interested in some related experiences. Note here that I'm going to be very careful with my language in order to maintain professional integrity. Apologies for the stilted language. I've been to a couple of prisons for academic stuff and work. These are not actually all that interesting, because I knew what the people in there were for, and it wasn't as if I was surprised that some of them were psychopathic. But those would be my first experiences. But my area of professional and academic expertise is child victimization. I've very occasionally seen psychopaths in the making, as it were. Victims who have been so terribly victimized and neglected that you can see them setting out on the path of an abuser or other type of criminal. It wasn't my responsibility to intervene, and I don't have any expertise in that area of things. But knowing the case histories, it was sad to watch. I've talked to a few police officers, social workers, and so forth about a few of them. It's like watching a large tree toppling in slow motion. You know it's going to crash into the ground, but there's not much you can do about it. I have met in a professional capacity, but in a roundabout sort of way, as it's not the usual stuff I do, the relative of a serial killer who was also once a suspect. I came away from that meeting knowing with certainty that they were the guiding hand behind the crimes of the serial killer. The police were pretty sure as well, but there was simply no evidence. Both are now deceased, and frankly, I'm not going to shed any tears for them. There was definitely familial abuse there as well. I have encountered some persons, a very small number, that were psychopathic and quite smart. This was through working within my field. One of these persons indicated that they were abusive towards animals in lieu of, or to work up to, children. I'm not going to repeat it, but what they said was something that haunts me to this day, and I haven't even been able to repeat to my closest friends or even my psychologist. Another one of these persons escaped justice. A very, very smart person. It was no one's fault. The investigation was excellent, the police were great, everything lined up, and a lot of justice was achieved. That person, however, escaped justice by being very, very smart. They were responsible for very serious, sustained offending, and would definitely be classed as a psychopath. Last, I met a friend of a person who used to be within my social circle who was also victimized in their childhood. I have a suspicion, without any solid evidence, that they have committed serious crimes. They hold down a professional job and are very successful in life. From the standpoint of someone who cannot diagnose psychopathy and was not treating or analyzing them, but has studied it, I would say that they lack any real empathy or conscience. A lot of their emotions, but not all, seem to me to be a simulated and conscious act. The abuse they suffered was of the worst possible kind. As a result, they were wary of most men, but warmed up to me a little due to the work I do. Abuse and neglect during the formative years seem to be a very common thread for many criminals and psychopaths. That said, I dare say there are some who are just wrong in the head, but I personally haven't encountered any of that sort. I'll end this already too long post with a word of caution to everyone reading. It's very easy to be horrified of the actions of psychopaths and criminals. It's easy to be fascinated by their psychology. But these are people, just like we are. Most of the time, their actions can be traced back to what happened to them, how they interpreted it, how they learned from their life experiences. There but for the lottery of birth. There aren't any evil monsters living under bridges or in forests, it's just us. We bear responsibility for the evil of psychopaths as a society, as communities and nations. We create the conditions for crime and evil. We are the monsters, and we create the monsters. As Oscar Wilde put it, we are each our own devil, and we make this world our. Story 16. I had one. And it was so bizarre and haunting. I was doing a psych evaluation on a tween. I think he was like 12 and was in the early stage of doing the clinical interview with him and his mother. The mother described various acts of violence the child had done in addition to other things, and I listened to the child's explanations of why. After I walked them out of the office, I remember talking to a colleague that this was the first time I had encountered a sociopath in the making. Story 17. The best way to know for sure is to sit down with a psychologist and tell them, without reservation, about your life and the way you experience the world. If you're more interested in self-diagnosis, although I would advise against it, as it's entirely meaningless due to self-deception and bias, there are plenty of resources available online. You could easily find a copy of the DSM-V with 5 minutes or less of online searching. If you're looking for personal experiences which align with yours, just read through Reddit. There are plenty of us floating around. Some things you could look for pretty easily too. Do you feel empathy? Have you ever felt bad for hurting someone? Do you get sad when people leave your life? Do you miss people when they leave? Are your emotions particularly strong or long-lived? Have you ever felt love? Are you generally law-abiding due to moral reasons? Do you get outraged at moral offenses? Are you prone to loneliness? If the answer to any of these questions is yes, then I would say it's unlikely that you're a sociopath. But then, I'm only able to speak from my own experience and am not a psychologist. So take it with a grain of salt. Story 18. Therapist here. A good sociopath will, on the surface, seem totally invested in treatment. They kind of schmooze you to impress you. Then eventually you catch on that they're manipulating you to think one way while they're totally behaving opposite of what you think. Also, if you're an empath and really pick up on people's moods vibes, sociopaths, psychopaths just give you a big gut feeling that something isn't right. You almost feel slimy after talking to them. That's my experience anyways. Story 19. I am a mental health professional working in corrections max security facility. In my experience, psychopaths will have this predatory stare, especially when they are trying to manipulate you. It is completely unnerving and hard to describe to someone unfamiliar with this population. They also tend to be narcissistic and overly charming, making a point to be overly friendly with you. Story 20. I'm not sure if he was a confirmed psychopath. I didn't interact with him long consistently enough to find out for sure. I was introduced to G at a party. He was dating a friend of mine who I went to uni with, who we'll call M. I hadn't seen her for a while. We're both good friends with another friend, A. A was hosting a party and M and G were there. I was introduced to G, and as soon as I went to shake his hand and met his eye contact, I knew something wasn't right. I felt the hair on the nape of my neck stand up, and a shiver run down my spine. It was like there was nothing behind his eyes. I heard a little voice in the back of my head telling me to run for the hills. I met him a few times after that, and each time my lizard brain was internally screaming at me, I was on edge the whole time. I heard through A over the course of the next 6 months about how G was manipulative, controlling, and vindictive towards M, and A was seeing less and less of M. A initially tried to reassure me that I was exaggerating and making it up, when I confessed I didn't like him right off the bat. Slowly she conceded that, okay, maybe G was on the spectrum or something. Eventually she agreed that he was manipulative, but never met me at psychopath. Either way, A and I both assisted M in leaving the relationship she was a live-in girlfriend towards the end, and she's now happily single. A freaky nightmare for her, but a happy ending. She's had some counseling and we've closed ranks around her, and she is now happy sort of that she's been through it because she feels she's less naive about the world. Story 21. I've always wondered how many high-functioning psychopaths are out there, like people with murderous, rapey impulses, and they are just able to suppress because they know how to function in society. Story 22. So after reading a lot of these, it's worth mentioning the following. 1. Psychologists rarely even use the term psychopath anymore. Those disorders which would fall under the umbrella of psychopathy are preferred to the otherwise generic and easily confused term of psychopath. Note, how many people frequently conflate psychopathy with narcissism. There's a narcissism personality disorder which fits many models of psychopathy, but not all so-called psychopaths are narcissists. 2. It often doesn't take training in psychology to spot so-called psychopaths. Formal training is needed to diagnose and treat it, but our brains are highly tuned to pick up on small things that our higher consciousness is often otherwise unaware of. This isn't to say that we should purely trust our gut. We're more often wrong than we'd like to admit, but how we feel about first impressions is often very important. 3. Far more people exhibit features of various psychopathic personality disorders than most realize. The vast majority of these people, however, live fairly ordinary, productive lives and don't exhibit violent tendencies. It has even been argued that psychopaths are an important evolutionary element, giving us people who can detach themselves from the human experience in order to provide valuable insights or behaviors the rest of us couldn't fathom. 4. Most of us will go through periods in our lives in which we often exhibit many symptoms of a personality disorder. But these are merely moments. They don't truly impact our lives in the way that a true disorder does. Story 23. Be wary of any responses here. Psychologists are bound to strict regulations prohibiting the disclosure of patient information. Excluding names isn't enough. I've seen real psychologists claim on similar threads that all the responses were fake. Story 24. Psychopaths are super common. Athletes and highly successful businessmen, for example, tend to score pretty high in testing. Likewise, so do I. It does not mean I'm a crazy murderer. I do have to keep myself in check a lot, though. Super impulsive, competitive, etc. I've actually benefited from the personality traits associated with it more so than not. Then again, it's also got me into a lot of trouble. I have pretty much zero regrets and not at all interested in things like long-term relationships or starting a family. I don't like watching channels like CI though. Too many similar comparisons that make me feel yuck. Story 25. Had this guy in waste management being treated for dizzy spells. The more he came in, the more messed up he seemed, had total disregard for human life but loved animals, especially ducks and horses. It got to the point where he was untreatable, had to be sent away. I'm pretty sure he was shot having dinner with his family. Story 26. Not a psychologist, but 4 days ago, after 35 years, I found out by myself that my father is either a psychopath or a hardcore narcissist, without him taking any guilt at all for anything or any feeling of remorse for what he is doing, having blamed and shamed me all my life when we were both alone, so there were never witnesses. You are the best son I can think of in public, and I'm so disappointed in you, and way more in private. Push and pull. You can't do anything right and think you are to blame. There was not much physical abuse because it seems they don't like to leave traces on your body. I did a ton of personal development work on my own for 4 years and left my home country 3 years ago because I thought something was wrong with me. I was lying in bed and cried out of fear of having to go into a mental asylum many times. 3 years of separation and hundreds or even thousands of hours of contemplation and building up knowledge about personal development and many insights lead me to freedom. Only to realize that because of this history with my father, I was in a relationship with a narcissist. Because I now was very sensitive, I could feel when I got manipulated by her, I cut cords immediately. You are a honeypot for these types of personality disorders because you are already weak and an easy prey. So chances are high that it's not only one person in your circle of friends, and you can literally trust no one who he has had any contact with at all. It is enough when people have had a nice first impression of him that they doubt everything you say, and by that increase the feeling that you already have that you are going insane. Because of this, if you have only the slightest suspicion, I'd suggest seeing a counselor, because he is a neutral person, and tell him about your suspicion. A clear sign after the break-in period where he/she gains your trust is that you feel confused, or like in my case, you think that something is wrong with your mind, or that you go insane if it goes long enough. Only after hardcore analyzing yourself and listening carefully how your body and mind reacts to the words spoken by that N or P, you have a slight chance to identify him/her. Also, another sign I think is overlooked too often is that when you have very low self-esteem, are insecure, constant self-doubting, etc., chances are high that you are under the influence of at least one abuser. Their biggest tool is that you trust every word of them, which makes it almost impossible to see what really is happening. Also, it, in my case, always happens off record, so you never have proof that they manipulate you. They are ultra nice to your friends, so when you start talking to them, they are on the side of the abuser, which can really drive you crazy with self-doubt. It must be like that to be physically abused, and everyone says you are responsible for having been abused. Victim shaming. And a last tip. If you realize it, Don't confront them and don't try to rescue people of his circle. You might have already the label crazy on you. He managed that. They have to lose their identity, which is for them the same as to die. So they might even kill to prevent this from coming out. Cut cords and never exchange any more words with them. Or their friends is my solution. And check your friends for signs of this behavior. It really is that creepy, or even more, after having read it again. Story 27. This article from the NY Times still haunts me. Can you call a 9-year-old a psychopath? I often wonder where the kid is now. What options would the parent have? Story 28. I worked with someone once who was well known. His sidekick, as we grew to call him, was void of soul. You could look at his eyes and it was blackness staring back at you. An emptiness I've seen in the eyes of known serial killers. And when you were near him, you could almost feel a vibration of evil. It was almost like watching a mime when he was forced to interact with others. Exaggerated facial expressions, often mimicking the person speaking to him. And when they walked away, his face clicked off like a TV set, tuned to static. There's more there, but I'll not say. Story 29. I'm a psychologist, but not a therapist. However, this weekend I got called out to my sister's home because her husband was threatening suicide. I got there, freaking out thinking that I was going to find a body, to him just sitting there sipping whiskey. He thought it was funny. I literally had my video camera out and had already Googled the sheriff's number in case I found him dead. We went inside after I chewed him the out, and he tried to tell me that he never said anything about hurting himself. He convinced me that my sister was overreacting and being dramatic. Well, my sister came home a few minutes later. I made it there before her, and she started reading the texts. Tell the kids I love them. Tell them to say their prayers. They're yes moms and no moms. Tell them not to feel sad. I want you to be happy. I don't want you to feel guilty about this. This wasn't your fault. This has always been my destiny. I'm trying to think of more, but it was basically a straight 20 minutes of this, and then he turned off his phone. So he basically wrote a suicide note in order to get a response from my sister and just lied directly to my face about it. Then, when he got confronted in front of me, he sat there talking about how he was in trouble. He lambasted my sister for calling his parents. I suggested counseling. He went off about how no mortal man can tell him about himself. So, TLDR, yesterday I realized my brother-in-law is a complete psycho. No empathy, no remorse, focused solely on himself, willing to put other people through just to get his way. I knew he had issues, but this is beyond anything I suspected, and he just still can't wrap his head around how awful it was. For anyone concerned, his own mother and father got involved, and they're making him stay with them until he gets some counseling. Well, see how that works out. Not really hopeful. Story 30. When describing some of the awful things he had done to people, he didn't express remorse, regret, or even anger. He expressed disdain. He was disdainful of people that he had irreparably harmed because he did not get enough out of it. He used them for his own ends, and he genuinely believed that they had failed him. Story 31. Not a psychologist, but I know a person who is diagnosed high on spectrum. Crazy interesting dude that you never fully trust. Met him through parties at university. He was the party guy. Always hosted the best ones, knew tons of people, your typical idolized party kid that everyone had wanted to be friends with. I always thought he was a liar and never really gave him a ton of my time or energy, but friends liked his parties, so we went. Went for a smoke one day, and he followed me down to talk and was trying to pull all his usual stuff. The microfacial expressions explains a lot why I didn't believe him in almost everything. He slept with a lot of girls. Like a lot. I never thought he seemed the type to just be a horny player. Could never put my finger on why. So he followed me down and started going off just talking, and I just kinda ignored him and pulled the ee-hoo thing. I had no interest in being lied to. Finally, he got fed up and started trying to turn the tables on me, saying I was stuck up. We could be great friends, ECT. I had enough and said basically, no, cause you're a blatant liar and use people, and I've seen this going on for over a year. Not interested. Then the oddest part happened. His face just went blank. And I don't mean blank like someone's who in shock or anything, like scary watching a horror movie blank. I, being the dummy I am, just stood there annoyed making eye contact. It felt like forever. Finally, he goes, how do you all this? I basically told him I could just tell, had a gut feeling. He uses people, he uses all the girls he sleeps with, and he uses the parties as attention, not anything else. That's when for the first time in the whole time I had ever seen him, he told the truth. Once again, I don't know how I knew, but I just knew. He has ASPD and was partially diagnosed when he was younger and confirmed when he got a bit older. I was right for his reasons why he did the stuff he did. Whole time he had this blank face with just the odd twitch on it. Then boom, he starts laughing and joking around again, trying to get a reaction from me. We had a few interactions like this over the years, and I still bump into him on odd occasions. He has always turned it into a game of when he takes girls home or obviously manipulates people apparently not obvious to them, of catching my eye and shooting me a wink, like we're in some private joke together. Story 32. I'm a bit late to this, so not sure this will be seen, but my wife is bugging me to share. I actually started my career in forensic psychology, but decided to get out of it after I got stabbed and assaulted a few times by patients. I then started working with children and teens. It was there, working with an 8-year-old girl, well, call her Sarah, that I came across my first-person id earmark as a psychopath. Sarah came from a pretty good family, and they were really dedicated to help her moving forward. The parents had no obvious concerns with their own behavior, and they seemed to be pretty well-regulated folks. They had bounced across a few therapists before seeing me, most of which seemed to struggle with the fact that Sarah did not seem to be demonstrating more traditional behavioral issues. E.g., she was not impulsive. She did not just lose her temper and go wild. Instead, Sarah was attentive, planning, and meticulous. She was pretty textbook in that she had a long history of mutilated Barbies and some quite hurt animals along her path. The part that was a bit unique with Sarah is she rarely got in trouble for doing anything because it seemed that she was really good at convincing other children, usually those a bit younger than he, of doing things. We got my foot in the door by doing some psych testing with Sarah. I had a booklet in front of her. Thing cost about $200 that we used for the tests. Sarah proceeded to slowly rip one page at a time while looking me in the eye. I have a pretty good poker face. She asked me what I was going to do about it. I said nothing. She continued. After a while, she admitted that she was surprised I had not reacted yet. I told her it wasn't my booklet and that I just work here. That actually was why she stopped. The next 9 hours I spent with Sarah continued with this kind of stuff. The most uncomfortable part was that she just stared at me constantly and tried to read my face. I think she was really thrown off by my lack of expression. When she was observed with her parents, she did the exact same thing. Child Protective Services was already well involved, and everyone was kind of unsure what to do about this kid. She was, fortunately, or unfortunately, about to move across the country and into a heavily wooded area. I remember her dad somewhat sadly joking, at least the animals there might fight back. I remember the parents just seemed scared. About 6 months after she moved, one of the worst fires in the history of the area happened and destroyed entire towns. I've always wondered if it was Sarah.